Rabbi Sachs, Lady Sachs, it's a great privilege and pleasure to have you with us this evening. Every university exists, it seems to me, to sharpen the intellect through question and answer. This place exists not to provide all the answers, but to ensure that the important questions can be asked. And for those of us who are people of faith, we experience delight in asking questions, and thereby glorify God in the greatest gift He has given us, the gift of our minds. And it's disturbing to me that even in academic circles, some questions are seen as not worth asking, and some arguments not worth having, and education sometimes becomes the transmission of formulae and becomes entirely passive in its aim. And this concern lies behind this evening's discussion. And it's in this context that I'm very happy to introduce Rabbi Jonathan Sachs.
Father White, I have to say that we had a parliamentary scandal in Britain some 15 years ago when it was discovered that certain members of parliament were being paid by public companies to ask questions in parliament. It was called the Cash for Questions scandal. And it suddenly occurred to me what the difference there exists between the English culture and the Jewish one. In England, you have to pay people to ask questions. In Judaism, you have to pay them not to ask questions. So it is the questions that, as we know, as I'm sure you know, without those questions of a child, we're just coming up to our festival of Passover, and the most sacred of all ceremonies, the Seder service, must start with the questions asked by a child. If there are no questions, there is no ritual. So I believe that life, it's God's question, and our existence is the only humble answer we can give. I have been asked to say a few words about whether communities of faith have lost the public intellectual argument. And I think to which my answer is an unequivocal yes, and on the other hand, no. And let me explain why. I believe in the short term, yes, but in the long term, no. And I'd like to explain why. We are going through, and of course it is not so evident here in America, in fact very much less evident here in America than it is in Europe, but Europe at the moment is going through one of the great historical ages of secularization. Indeed, through an age, I don't know if they've really hit you here in the States, but of extraordinarily aggressive atheism. Have you come across our aggressive atheists yet? Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and so on. And I'm really interested why this has happened. What lies behind this historic secularization, probably the deepest since the conversion of Constantine in the early 4th century. It seems to me that the reasons are these. Number one, until recently, we have been going through a period of almost unprecedented affluence. And there is a general truth set out with great eloquence by Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, that when people have everything to thank God for, that's when they forget to thank Him. When they have very little to thank Him for, and moments of crisis, that is when they remember. If I can summarize Moses' thesis in Deuteronomy, he turns to a people who have known slavery in Egypt and 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and he says, you think that was the challenge? No. What will be the real challenge will not be slavery and poverty, but freedom and affluence. It is almost always when civilizations are at their peak that they begin inwardly to decline and decay. And that is a great danger of our time. Number two, of course, much more specifically, we've become much more conscious since 9/11 of religious extremism, which continues to destabilize many of the parts of the world ever since to this day. And that was when we began to see the books by Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. And it was clearly in response to that strand of religious extremism which we had become unfamiliar with in the West and which has now resurfaced. Number 3, there is, I think, no doubt that secularists, certainly in Europe, are disturbed by the sheer persistence of faith. Already in the 18th century, any self-respecting intellectual was convinced that religion was on its deathbed, was at least in intensive care, yet it survives, improbably, in many cases stronger than it ever was. If I can give an example, I am an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. And Orthodox Judaism here in the United States was thought in the 1920s to be in its very last phase. A member of the rabbinical class in the Rabbi Chaplain Theological Seminary in Yeshiva University in the 1920s wrote in his memoirs that we were told as students that Orthodoxy was dying and our job was to give it a decent burial. Yesterday, in that same seminary, we celebrated the ordination of 230 rabbis, the largest number in American Jewish history. Orthodoxy itself, according to the Pew Report on Jewish Life in America, which appeared in November of last year, is the only group that is currently growing in American Jewry. Now this is extremely interesting. You take Germany in the early 19th century. Jews in Germany in the early 19th century were convinced that Hebrew and Judaism were at an end and therefore could be studied scientifically for the first time ever as specimens in a museum. They started a movement called Jüdische Wissenschaft, and its great leader, Leopold Zunz, was convinced that Hebrew was a dead language. It is said that on meeting a Hebrew poet, he met somebody who told him that I am a Hebrew poet, and Zunz turned to him and said, tell me, when did you live? I mean, to be able to say that 200 years on, Hebrew is a vital, living language, a language in which Nobel Prize-winning authors like Agnon have written, is quite extraordinary. So, religion is used, like Mark Twain, to reading its own obituary. And understandably, this upsets secularists very much indeed. If I can give you a Jewish example, there used to be an old Yiddish superstition that said it was unlucky to be the first person buried in a new cemetery. Though as somebody commented, being the second person is also not unlucky. It is said, and this is a true story, and it exists in writing in the old Jewish encyclopedia, it is said that one town in Eastern Europe, actually everyone was so superstitious that when the town warden was about to open the new cemetery, nobody was willing to be the first person buried. And the town actually hired a very, very aged Jew to be the first person to be buried in the cemetery. What turned out, you can predict, right? Dying gave him a new interest in life. He go around saying, I'm Yossela, the town dyer, and he lived another 10 years, and everyone else had to wait. So somehow or other, telling religion that it's about to die does do wonders for its figures. So that's number 3.